Brooke here. I hope wherever you are in the world, today is treating you well. So I am just sitting down. I have class in a little while. My children are still at school. My in-laws are picking them up, and I have a little bit of time. So I wanted to make a video that I was going to make anyway, but it's a little more laid back, and I'm just jamming out. So I'm like, you know what? Let me make a video. Today I wanted to talk about the pros and cons of having children young versus waiting a little while. And the pros and cons to both, just in my experience as someone who did have kids young. I just wanted to share this with you all, give you my perspective. This is not at all like a comprehensive list. This is just pretty much my experience, my story, my perspective, and you know, take it for what it's worth. But I did want to share that with you all today. It's a topic that I haven't ever really brought up, but I have definitely gotten questions about my age, especially when I was younger, and people would kind of piece together like, oh, well, how old are you? Or how old are your kids? And like, you know, there's always like this kind of like, I always felt like a little bit judged by it. So I'm vocal about it now. You know, I'm older. I feel a lot more comfortable in my skin than I used to. So that's just a story that I wanted to share with you all, especially because I really want to engage with my viewers. I really want to share my story and hopefully inspire others, or at least give them the confidence to share their own story, because everyone has a story. That's why I make it a point to never judge unless you cut me off without using a blinker, but that's beside the point. Anyway, with that said, let's jump into today's video. So before I begin, I do want to say that there are definitely a lot of pros to having kids young. There are definitely pros, strong pros, to waiting till you're a little older. So this is not to be biased. This is just to share my experience. I was a young mom. I found out I was pregnant with my oldest daughter when I was 19. My then boyfriend, now husband, and I were together for about a year and a half. And I have to say, when I found out that I was pregnant, I was like, oh my God, what am I gonna do? Like, I didn't even know anything about taking care of a child. And I felt very blessed in the sense that my husband was always my ground, and he always really gave me the confidence and the security that I needed. Not even like financial, because that's definitely a con that I'll get to in a second with having kids young, but it was always like the security, the emotional support, and he really was like my rock in essence. I also came from a great family, and they were always very supportive. When I was pregnant, unfortunately, I lost my father at 6 months pregnant. So in my experience from being a young mom, or, you know, starting the journey of motherhood so young, and then losing my father young, it kind of pushed me into a different maturity space than I think I would have been ready for had I not been pregnant. I definitely grieved a little bit differently and whatnot, but without you know, all that whole story aside, because like I said, everyone has a story, and we can certainly talk about that for a while. I do believe that having a child young, really, for me, it really did help me to grow up. I grew up with my daughter in essence. So I was 20 when I had my oldest, and I have to say that I'm gonna jump into the pros first, and then I'm gonna go to the cons. So the first pro of having children young, I was 20 when I had my oldest, 22 when I had my second child, and I was 27 when I had my youngest. So I was still young, but older with my youngest. And it was definitely like differences, right? Like not anything crazy, not like 37, but it was definitely differences. The first real pro I'd have to say is that I truly feel that like time is on my side, right? Now everyone, you know, we're not guaranteed the next day, right? We're not guaranteed tomorrow. So you have to always live in the moment. You have to always be present. And that's something that I focus on, especially with dealing with anxiety. But when it comes to being a young mom, you know, you really do have like, you're young, you know, like you have a lot of time to grow with your children, to be present with them, to, you know, roll around with them, to play. And this is not to say that older parents don't do that, but there's definitely a situation with having children young that, let's say, you know, for example, like wanderlust, right? I'm someone that my family and we always joked around, even though I was always serious, that I would be living in Africa by the time I was like 20 years old, 18 or 20 years old, whatever. And I always said, I was like, you know, I love America, but I very much want to, you know, be on the safari and visit rainforest and, you know, save animals and do all this stuff. And when I had my oldest daughter, I remember thinking, I'm like, I'm never gonna visit Africa. But that was only because I was scared and I was nervous, and it was a big journey for me of motherhood. But the fact that I had them young, now that I'm 35, by the time I'm 40 years old, my older two daughters will be my oldest one would be 20, my middle child would be 18, and then my little one would still be young, but I can now travel. I have time on my side where I kind of got the kids out of the way early, and I hate to say that because if I could, I would jump back into them being toddlers with the financial distress and all. I miss those days so much, and it was such a blessing. I had so much fun when they were little. But I do feel like in that regard, you have a lot of time, right? And so I can still be an adult, right? Like when my kids grow up, I can still be, a good age. I can still be relatively young and be able to live the rest of my life. So let's say 45, 50 years old. Now I'm like, all right, Costa Rica, baby. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of the benefit of having kids young, is that you can kind of pick up where you left off when your kids are older. Whereas when you're older, oftentimes, and this doesn't even have to be a con, but oftentimes parents who choose to have children older, they usually have already gotten the travel out of the way. They've already, they've seen the world. I mean, I can't tell you how many conversations I've kind of had to respectively bow out of because the parents were talking about visiting Spain and going to Argentina and the Galapagos Islands and all these different places. And I'm over here like, hey, I went to Yellowstone twice. You know what I mean? Like that was it. But with that said, I think that that's a very strong pro. I think that's a pro. Another pro is just the vitality. Now, again, this isn't to say that someone who's 40 years old that decides to have their first child does not have, vitality and is not going to roll around with their kids and play around and stuff. But there's a different level when you're that young. When I was 22, 23 years old, I'd strap my kids on my back, I'd have one on the back, one on the front. I had so much energy, running around, going to the park, doing all these things, joining all these little groups and stuff. And my whole day was jammed packed. I couldn't imagine having a kid now, really because my oldest is going to be 15 and I'm at a different place in my life. I'm a different journey. I feel like even just the energy level, it's like, oh, we're getting a puppy next month and I'm already thinking like, I'm gonna have a new baby, but then I'm like, oh, I have to wake up in the middle of the night, So there's definitely like when you're younger, you just have more energy and you can be a kick-ass 50-year-old, rocking it, energy, everything like that. But there's a difference. There's a different vibe, when you're younger having kids as opposed to older having children. It's just a different vitality, different energy level, and that's just across the board. Get the healthiest 50-year-old, they will say that. Well, sometimes they'll say they have more energy than when they were 25, but generally speaking, you don't, right? You don't have as much of that oomph as you would when you were younger. So I'd have to say the third pro is that you relate more to your children. Again, disclaimer, not to say that when you're older you don't relate to your kids, but when you're younger you definitely relate more to your kids. Perfect example, my daughter had a couple of her girlfriends over and they were talking about Tamagotchis. And I was saying like how I remembered I used to have Tamagotchi or nano pets. And for those of you who are listening, you know what I'm talking about. And there's like a resurgence, right? It seems that like the 90s is like coming back. That's like more like on trend now. But Spice Girls, Tamagotchis, and I remember I like interjected and I'm like, hey, I had Nano Kitty and I had the Tamagotchi and I remember I liked Nano better and then Nano Baby, and like we're having a conversation, whereas like the other parents, they're not really relating because they didn't grow up with the Tamagotchis, or they didn't grow up with those toys, or even like the music, like there's just different things that a younger parent can relate to with their child than, let's say, someone who's 40 or 50 years old relating with a 12 or 13-year-old. It's just different. Now, that's something those are like the biggest pros that I've seen. There's a lot, but I'm trying to keep this list short. So like I said, there are definitely a lot more pros, but I'm only listing a few to keep this video shorter. Now, on to the cons. And some people don't like to admit that there are real cons to having children young, but there most certainly are. When it comes to stability, on average, this is not for everybody, but on average, a younger family, or let's say like in my situation, I wasn't married, so I was most certainly not as stable as I am now. I am in a different position now than I was at 19 years old. I could comfortably bring another child into my family, but I'm not going to. But I'm just saying, like, if I were, like, I would be more prepared than I was at 19. The stability factor is big because if you don't, a lot of times, see, this is, again, my experience, but a lot of times if there's no stability, or if there's lack of stability, or if there's a real shaky foundation, it really does extend into, into the years, right? It's not something that gets better immediately. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of struggle, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of working together with your partner. And sometimes it takes years. It could take years to get a solid ground, a solid footing. And it took me years. It took me well into me having my diaper service to get grounded. But I don't regret it. It was worth it. All that good stuff. But I would say that's a big con with having kids young is the stability. The stability is definitely a thing. And that leads into the financials. The financial situation is huge, right? Like, unless you're getting help from your spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend that has money, or your family supporting the baby, it's going to be a rocky ride. I was cleaning houses before I started my diaper service. I was always someone that had little niche businesses. I never did the welding thing as a business, which is something that I definitely at some point in my life want to get into. But I had a cleaning service, and I remember I was 8 months pregnant with my oldest, and I was on the floor, hands and knees, cleaning people's floors. That's what I was doing. And I remember one time in particular, this gentleman told me to stand up, and I was like really embarrassed, right? I was like so embarrassed. I was like, people are judging me. I never lost a customer because of it. But this guy in particular paid me for 4 sessions. He was like, listen, he's like, I know you're gonna stop soon because you're due. He's like, but take this money. He's like, I know you need it. He's like, you can come back after the baby's born and you start doing this again. He's like, but I can't have you cleaning my floors on your hands and knees, being pregnant. I don't feel right about it. And I remember that was a very sobering moment for me. I'm like, oh my God, because how am I going to make money if I can't work, if people don't want me in their houses, this, that, and the third. And I remember I was very nervous. And my husband, he worked so much. He's such a good supporter. He's such a wonderful guy. And, he was working 2 jobs, and we were really just trying to make ends meet. But when you're older, oftentimes you are financially stable. You do have a career where you're making good money. You have your financials in order in the sense of savings accounts. Maybe if you already started like a Gerber type of savings account or whatever they're called. Definitely, I would say that that's a huge one. And there are people that I know in my life that had kids young that struggled for a long time. Some people don't get out of that loop unless, again, you have hard work, determination, and you're willing to sacrifice. That's just how it is. And I'd have to say the third, so you have stability, you have finances, and then I would say patience, but patience actually would be more towards a pro for having children young, because I find that 2 things, emotional immaturity and patience, they're similar, but they're different. So I would think that patience you have more of when you're younger. When I was younger, I could hear my daughter scream in my ear all day. But now it's like I hear a baby crying. I'm like, oh my God, I would never do that in front of somebody, but it's kind of like, whoa, that's going right through my head, I don't know how I'm gonna do it with this puppy barking. We'll see how it goes. But I would say that the con would be, because it's different than patience, his patience would be a pro. And I think that would be a con for when you're older, because I find that a lot of people lose patience as they age. The emotional maturity would be would be a con in the sense of if you have your children young and you're not yet grown, you haven't really dealt with real life issues, that could definitely hinder, your development stage or whatever, or how you are as a parent. Or, I know in my situation, I was always, my husband's a little older than me, so I was, I guess, more a little immature than he was. But I'm telling you, when I got pregnant with my daughter, my whole life changed. I was, after my father passed away, I was definitely a different person, but it took me years again to kind of, develop a good emotional fitting. And again, I'm someone that, I suffer from depression, anxiety, OCD, Tourette syndrome, all the fun stuff, all the gang, right? The anxiety gang. That was hard for me to be more, mature with handling difficulties, whether they be situations with customers or situations with my spouse, or not even just always argumentative, just things in general. Whereas I feel like when you're older, you're more grounded. You're someone that's able to be more pragmatic, think more practically, handle situations that are given to you, right? Or that you're experiencing. I feel that that's definitely like a real pro to having kids older. And another thing is not to stick with financials, because I do feel that a lot of things in life you can't buy, and that is, you know, a loving home and things like that, and having a good relationship with your kids. And but one thing that's big is, you know, when you're older, you can afford the things that you're just not going to afford when you're younger. Like, for example, I could never, when I was younger, I would have never thought that we're not a high income family at all by any means. We're humble people, blue collar workers, but I would have never thought that I would be able to send my kids to private school. Whereas, you know, now it's like that's a real thing. My children are in great schools and we sacrifice greatly to send our kids there. And I'm very open about that. It's our biggest expense by far, but it means a lot to us. But when I was younger, I would have never thought that. I would have been like, it's all right, whatever, blah, 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 you know? But there's a lot of things, even like down to clothes, the type of food you're feeding your children. Like, there's a lot of things you can do when you're older that you're just not able to do when you're younger. And then even like the work-life balance. Like when you're older, a lot of times you have babysitters set up, you have a good routine. Maybe you were able to take leave, you have PTO. When you're younger, you probably haven't accrued that. I know for me as a laborer, I didn't accrue that. You know, I was a welder, and then I started a cleaning service, and then for many years I owned my own business. So there was a lot of things I didn't have that someone that has a career, that works for someone, would have had. So it was always a struggle. And I remember when my youngest was born, I was literally in the hospital. Hand to God, I was in the hospital and I was taking calls. I was answering emails. My daughter was 3 days, like not even three days old. She was literally 3 hours old. It was right after I got her back. I remember she got a bath and everything, and I'm breastfeeding her and I'm answering emails. Like I was so like excited to have a baby. But I knew like I had to keep on top of it. I had to keep on top of things. And I was just very neurotic. So it was a lot of multitasking, whereas I feel like if you're in a more calm financial situation, you don't have to be like that, right? So, so with that said, there are so many pros and cons to both. I mean, me in my life, I truly believe that had I not gotten pregnant when I did, I probably would have either waited or would have never had children, only because my life would have taken me into different paths. Like if I did go to Africa, if I did go to Zimbabwe, I feel like other things would have taken precedent. But I have to say my children are the best thing that's ever happened to me. I love them to pieces. I wouldn't have done it any other way. There's a lot of lessons that I learned along the way, but I do acknowledge that it was difficult. And you know, in some ways it still is difficult. It still is, you know, catch up, constantly feeling like you're playing catch up, constantly feeling like I know in my situation, my husband and I, we are like, the by far the poorest people in my kids' schools, and both of them. But we're very humble, we're very modest, we're very grateful to be there, you know? But I see what other people were able to do, especially because there is such an age gap. I think like the average age of the mom over there is like 50, you know? So like they have younger kids and they're older, but they're far more financially successful than we are. So you see that time can work in both ways. Time can work in, you know, giving you more time with, you know, your kids, being able to grow up with your kids and then have a life later, or, you know, working, or, you know, using your investments to your advantage, waiting a while, living your life, and then having children. So whichever way you decide is not wrong. Everyone is different. My biggest thing is not to judge people. You know, don't judge a book by its cover. And one of my favorites is don't judge someone by the chapter you walked in on. Like for me, I am, it's a very humble situation because I am in the trades and I enjoy what I do. It's a lot of work. And I know people that would be like, oh, well, you had a business once, but now you're working. You know, it's like, well, it's just my journey. I'm taking different routes, right? But whichever way, you know, you decide to have children, it is a blessing, certainly. And I'm just very grateful. So thank you all for tuning into my video, and I will check you back again on the next video. Take care, friends.